Okay, so we're now recording, so Peg and Chi and anyone else who wants to check it out or anyone who wants to review afterwards will be able to disseminate the class to them. And let's start off with a little good and welfare. How is everyone doing? How was Thanksgiving? Any plans for Hanukkah? What's going on?
Well, as I said, my Thanksgiving was spent being very thankful that my dad had recovered from COVID. We couldn't see him on Thanksgiving, but I made him a full Thanksgiving dinner on Tuesday. And then, as only a good spouse would, my wife drove it across town while I was at work on Wednesday so that he could eat when he wanted on Thursday. But he
That
is
is so lovely. Go
fully
Team
recovered.
Barron.
Yeah.
Oh, so
Wow.
John and Leanna, we haven't seen them, eh? No?
No.
They generally join right about now, so
Yeah, okay,
maybe they're about to join.
I'm gonna make a note, John and Leanna and Peg, I need to touch base with, and maybe Chi.
Rachel, is your father still in the hospital?
He's not. I never had him go to the hospital.
Oh, okay.
Hospitals are a pretty risky place for somebody who is almost completely deaf and 81. So I managed him at home with a pulse oximeter and blood pressure cuff and thermometer and homemade food. And as long as he was strong enough to get himself to the bathroom and back, and I wanted him at home. I can't tell you how many people I've known whose last days were an unfamiliar environment where they took a tumble out of bed or something like that. So even though I'm in healthcare, I'm a little adverse to hospitals unless you really need it.
Yeah, so I'm so glad to hear that he's doing better, and you use the word recovered. That's
Yeah, I released him from isolation on Friday. He promptly went and did grocery shopping, and then the next day he got his haircut and got Chinese takeout. So, leave it to an 81-year-old who's lost 15 pounds in 15 days to go and get takeout right after they get released from isolation.
what's this story with his hearing? What's up with his hearing?
So when Dad was diagnosed with prostate cancer, he got herpes shingles right away, and it attacked his auditory nerves, and he went from fully hearing to 10% hearing in the span of 24 hours.
Mm.
So he's
And that's wait, so herpes is connected to shingles, is connected to hearing?
herpes zoster. That's what and shingles, yeah, shingles can attack any nerve in your body, any nerve root. And so for him, it attacked the cranial nerve that controls his hearing.
Wow.
So,
I gather he had not had the shingle shot.
no, this was many, many years ago, probably 20 years now. It didn't even exist then.
So
Yeah.
I know I got a shingles shot. I think it's a series of 2. Because, just even as a rabbi watching people who've had shingles, I knew that was something I did not want to contend with. So I'll just put that out there. Most of the people on this screen are extremely young, but it's something to just tuck away. At what age would one be eligible for that?
50.
So
although they will give it to you early. I've had shingles and I'm
Well-
not 50, and they will give you the shot earlier if you're susceptible to it, I guess. You just have to kind of advocate for yourself.
Yeah, so it's something to just tuck away, because it's extremely, I was going to say uncomfortable, probably painful is more appropriate if you experience that shingles. And since there is a vaccine for it, definitely recommend, as a rabbi, you get a tiny bit of medical knowledge because you're always dealing with different people with different situations. So you get a little window into what that's like. And my window into shingles was enough to say, I want that vaccine.
Both Larry and I got the shingles shot a couple of years ago.
Yeah, that was smart. The other thing I just want to say is just responding to Rachel's comment, 15 pounds in 15 days. I know, hi, Chi. So nice to see you. Oh, don't we all wish we were holding that baby? Tell us everything.
She's screaming. So yeah, she's doing okay.
Uh-huh.
Little colicky, so that's been hard. But my dad came to stay with us for a couple days, so he's helping out. Thank God.
And how old is she? And what's her name?
She's gonna be 4 weeks. Actually, she's 4 weeks today.
Happy birthday to, what's her name?
We call her Kiki. Her name is Akila, but we like Kiki better.
That's adorable.
Yep.
Did you name her?
No, her biological mom named her. So, but we get to call her whatever we want. So I'm gonna mute myself, and then after I feed her, I have to feed myself, so I can turn my camera off so it's not distracting to you guys.
Whatever you need to do, you just do. It's a joy to see both of you.
Gee, did you do any of the paintings behind you?
No, that's an artist called Klimt.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was noticing them earlier.
Has anybody heard of the weird small world that she and I have? Which is that when she invited me to her baby shower, I saw her address and realized that she lives next door to where I used to live. Like,
No, what a
my
ride.
next door neighbors were like the most wonderful neighbors, and we used to spend time going back and forth. And when I saw the address, I was like, so I pulled it up on Google Earth just to make sure, and I was like, gee, that's my house. I painted the house that color. So she gave me a full update on what happened to my old neighbors, which was kind of sad, but at the same time, she lives in this wonderful Haver home that I was so excited when I heard that we had this connection. So
It
really
is a super cool connection.
totally.
Again, going back to Rachel's dad, I just want to, respond to the weight thing, because this is another thing that I see again and again in my world from my foxhole, is that, God forbid people get sick, they go to the hospital, immediately there's significant weight loss. 10 pounds standard. So, for those of us who may struggle, have challenges with our weight, I think the flip side of it and the way to look at that is that also as you age, it's not such a bad thing to have a little bit of something to give up for the cause, because God forbid something happens. My father had Parkinson's, and he was, I guess you would probably medically say, morbidly obese. He was 5'8", and probably at one time, 325, maybe more. He was a big guy. And by the time he died, he was down to probably about 140 pounds. One of the interesting things that happens with Parkinson's is because your body is in constant motion, you're constantly burning calories. And if he hadn't had all of that extra weight, he wouldn't have gotten all of that extra time that he had. So I just think it's interesting because we never really hear about that aspect of weight, that it does, that is in some way our bodies protecting our survival and making sure that, we have a little bit of something extra just in case we need it. And I see, Rachel, you're shaking your head. So
That's what they teach in nursing school, is that you should start having conversations with people when they're about 65, that they should have about 15 pounds above their ideal body weight, starting at about 65, for just that purpose. So my father and I got into this big discussion about, it was good that he had it. I have it too. Then when he fought with me, you don't have it, so it was a friendly bantering back and forth. But yes, it is very important to have enough weight that you can withstand an acute illness, because people who are underweight and elderly really do very poorly when they have something big happen to them.
Well, it's good to have you validate what I've observed anecdotally. So-
Sorry, I missed it, Rachel. Is your dad okay now?
My dad is great.
Oh,
Hair
good.
stopped and Chinese food for dinner. So yeah, I can't even tell you. There were nights I stayed up the whole night just praying because I was so nervous. So it was not an easy trek for him, and we're just so grateful.
Yeah,
And-
we share your joy, a Hanukkah miracle.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and you're going to be receiving communication from the temple. We are collecting up stories from people, not a story, like just a one sentence video of, a miracle that I experienced this year. We're going to share those on the Shabbos of Hanukkah. So bear those in mind when you get that email. And Rachel, there you've got the story right there. Good. Any other questions or comments before we delve into Hanukkah? You all received that big packet that I sent. Oh, very good. And Yashina did make me a fancy cover, but I didn't bother sending it to you. I'll save it for the files. But I wanted to kind of walk through some of the various perspectives on Hanukkah, beginning on the very last page, page 27, to make sure that we understand the history of what is behind this holiday. So you have on page 27 the timeline. So what happened was in the year 198, and we're BCE here, before the Common Era, Judea and Samaria, the territory held by the Israelites, became part of the Seleucid Empire. And in the year 175, a king by the name of Antiochus IV, he called himself Antiochus Epiphanes or Epiphanes, I guess maybe they say in Greek, he ascended the throne. And like many rulers, he needed money for the sustenance of his kingdom. Taxes are not a new phenomenon. Taxes have been part of the human experience for quite some time. Epiphanes, by the way, translates as God incarnate. So he saw himself, as did the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, as a god. And I think there's a subtext footnote to consider here about what happens when leaders think that they are God. That is usually problematic. So in the year 168, his troops came to the temple in Jerusalem and looted the temple, began massacring the Jewish community, and they forbade the practice of Judaism, and specifically circumcision and Torah study. So circumcision was prohibited, the outward sign of what it is to be Jewish, and a Torah study was also outlawed, because if we couldn't transmit our tradition from one generation to the next, it would effectively be done. And there were many acts of resistance. The story of Hanukkah is not contained in the biblical text at all. It happened so late in Jewish history that it was after the Tanakh had already been completed. So the historical sources for the story of Hanukkah are in the books of the Maccabees, which are part of what is called the Apocrypha. Apocrypha are a collection of sacred texts that didn't quite make it into the biblical canon. And if, we think about Hanukkah like it's a very light holiday in our minds. It's dreidel and it's menorah and it's gelt and it's presents. And however, a couple of years ago, I took it upon myself to really read in cover to cover the books of the Maccabees. And I got to tell you, it is a horrendously gruesome depiction of massacre and torture, and it wasn't all I have a little dreidel. So I'm not necessarily recommending it, but the stories of martyrdom are incredibly gruesome. Martyrdom and torture. And in 167, Antiochus ordered an altar to the god Zeus set up in the temple. And one of the ways that they impacted the morale of the community was to force the leaders of the community to worship at these idolatrous altars throughout the environment. And there was a priest named Mattathias, and he had 5 sons. They become known as the Maccabees, and Judah, the eldest son of Judah the Maccabee. You might have heard of that. 166, Mattathias died, and Judah took his place. So they began what was basically a guerrilla campaign against the forces of Antiochus. And they were called the Zealots because they said, whoever is zealous for God, come with us. And by the way, even among the Jewish community, there wasn't unanimity that this Hellenization, this becoming Greek, was such a bad thing. There were plenty of Jews who looked at Hellenistic culture and found it to be much more elevated and much more sophisticated, and were very ready to give up their Jewish identity to become Greek. So it's not everyone who was all upset with these efforts of Antiochus. But meanwhile, there were enough individuals who wanted to fight for the right of freedom of religious expression, as we would say from our contemporary American perspective, that they did so. And they fought a 3-year battle from 168 to 165, and ultimately were victorious against the forces of Antiochus. And it's interesting to look at the contrast between Purim and Hanukkah. So both of those situations were places where there was a threat to the existence of the Jewish people. Purim was a threat to our physical existence. You remember Haman's thing was, on this date, we're going to kill all of the Jews. Antiochus was not about killing the Jews. His was a spiritual threat. Antiochus' thing was, you can't be Jewish anymore. So you're perfectly welcome to live, but you just can't live as Jews. So Purim represents the physical threat, and Hanukkah, the spiritual threat. So then after the forces of Antiochus were defeated, the Israelites come to the temple. They get it all clean and shiny and sparkly. And the word Hanukkah translates as rededication. So they were rededicating the temple. And now let's talk about the 8 days of Hanukkah. So we know, of course, the classic story of, as I like to put it, the little jar of oil that could, right? You know, the story is, oh, they came to rededicate the temple, the menorah, which, by the way, the menorah refers to the 7-branched candelabrum that burned in the temple, and that is a symbol of the Jewish state. Even today, if you've been to Israel, you see outside the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, the menorah, the 7-branched candelabrum. What we burn at Hanukkah is technically called a Chanukkah, that has place for 8 candles plus 1 shamash, 1 helper candle. So they were trying to light the menorah, the 7-branched candelabrum, in the temple. And the story goes that they only found enough purified oil to light for 1 day, and they lit it not knowing where the resources were going to come from to light for the next few nights, because it's, you know, a process to make that oil. They just couldn't make it enough quantity. It's sort of like the vaccine, you know, how fast can we make all the vaccine that we need. And we know Nes Gadol Hayasham, a great miracle happened there, as written on our dreidels, and the oil burned for 8 days, and thus 8 days of Hanukkah. So I am here to burst that bubble and to tell you that there are 0 contemporaneous sources to attest to that story. It actually doesn't appear until several hundred years later in the Talmud. Hanukkah was not widely observed at the time. It was kind of a local event. There was still a Jewish community at that time. I shouldn't say still, already a Jewish community at that time in the diaspora. And they weren't as connected to this event in Jerusalem. So the leadership in Jerusalem had to promulgate the holiday of Hanukkah. Oh, and you should all observe these days, and you should remember these days. So it didn't exactly catch on as a holiday right away, but eventually it did. But to the point that the rabbis several hundred years later, 200-300 years later, are writing in the Talmud, in the section about lighting, about lights. When do we light different candles for different occasions? And one of the rabbis says, "My Hanukkah, what's Hanukkah?" And that's when we get this story about the little jar of oil and the 8 days. And that's when it first appears in Jewish tradition. The speculative reason for that is because the Jews during that Talmudic period were under the thumb of the forces of Rome. So it didn't seem politically wise to have this big holiday about how, you know, we had these foreign overseers and we had a rebellion and we threw them off. So the focus of the holiday shifts from that military victory to this story about the oil. Does anybody remember from studying elsewhere what the real reason is for the 8 days of Hanukkah? Oh, good. I'm so glad you stopped by. So the original holiday of Hanukkah was called Sukkot She B'Kislev, the holiday of Sukkot in the month of Kislev. That's how Hanukkah got to be 8 days. During the war, there was a war going on. It wasn't exactly the time to build a sukkah and sit and enjoy the harvest festival. So as soon as the temple was rededicated, they said, we missed Sukkot a couple of months ago. Let's have our 8-day festival of Sukkot that we didn't get to do in Tishrei, now in Kislev. So Hanukkah was originally Sukkot She B'Kislev, and then out of political necessity, the emphasis got shifted and this story of the jar of oil emerged. So that's just a little bit about the historical background of the holiday. Any comments or questions about that before I shift focus?
Is there something about the fact that they made it into a kind of revolution? You know, we were fighting back and kind of creating a holiday related to Jewish autonomy, that they kind of co-opted the Hanukkah real reason in order to make this less of a cushy holiday and more of a, I don't want to say militaristic, but like a victorious holiday.
I think it was just the opposite. It was a militaristic, victorious moment, and it was too threatening to be celebrating that. So one of the incredible things about Jewish tradition is the way our tradition retains all of these symbols and rituals and holidays and traditions, and then they can be adapted to whatever the contemporary environment is. So Hanukkah is a great example of that. So in the Middle Ages, when there was a lot of incidents of martyrdom between the Inquisition and the Crusades, then the themes of martyrdom, and we're going to talk, if we get to it, about Hannah and her 7 sons, which is one of the stories of martyrdom around the holiday of Hanukkah that is in the book of Maccabees. So in the Middle Ages, the Jewish people really connected with that theme of martyrdom. Oh, look, we had these martyrs at the time of the Maccabees, and now we have that Maccabean spirit, and we're also martyrs. Then, you look at contemporary America. One of the things we're not going to look at is on page 26, the December dilemma. But Lord knows, if we didn't have Hanukkah to compete with Christmas, we would have had to invent it, because the Christmas is so culturally overwhelming that we need something to cling to as ours. Anybody who has raised kids in the contemporary United States probably faced that challenge. Susan, I see you shaking your head. How did that come up for you?
Well, I was, as you talk about it, I think about when my girls, who are in their late 20s and early 30s now, when they were in elementary school and they went to public school, that in the beginning, it was the Jewish parent would be asked to come in and do something Hanukkah. And I did it the first grade, whatever, because they actually went to a Jewish school for kindergarten. But then I said, wait, why am I doing this? I don't want to see Christmas necessarily in the classroom. So there's no reason for me to be bringing Hanukkah into the classroom, because they're just at the same time. But I can't tell you how many times that people would say to my children, whether it was their Girl Scout leader, I feel sorry for you because you don't.
Yeah.
And also, getting the question, is it okay if your child goes Christmas caroling with us? Or is it okay if they make ornaments? And, this was just a theme, but I was looking at your questions, and both of my daughters were in music. One was in choir and one was in band in high school. And they actually liked playing the Christmas music because of the composition, because of the arrangements and the way it was presented. They didn't think of it, but there was always a perfunctory Hanukkah song thrown in. So it was a challenge. It really was. But I think my kids had enough of their Judaism that they could appreciate other people's religions and not just, feel bad about it.
Yeah,
but I don't think it belongs in the classroom under any circumstances.
right. I totally agree. And I'm sure that it's not the case that Christmas is absent from public schools in many, many environments. So that might be the ideal, but I don't know that it's the reality for many of our kids.
Oh, yeah. Well, Bonnie, you and I grew up in Brooklyn, and I don't remember it.
Yeah, Brooklyn wasn't.
It was seasons greetings and snowmen and ice skating.
Brooklyn wasn't an issue, but I remember, when I was a rabbi in the East Valley for 18 years, and parents telling me, it's not even just the Christmas carols. It's that the math problems are Christmas related, and the spelling words are Christmas related, and it's an entire month for our kids to be made to feel that they are different.
You know, it's funny because I was a buyer for Dillard's department stores for many, many, many years. And part of December, we had to be in the stores, like executives had, from the home office had to be in the stores. And I remember being out at Fiesta Mall, and that store manager, his name was Greg Axe, would walk through the store at noon with his guitar, and he wanted everyone behind him to be singing the Christmas carols. And we got to Silent Night and he looked at me, Meshcow, you're not singing. And I'm like, you're right, I'm not. Deal with it.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. So I also think that one of the themes in the United States that's a theme of Hanukkah that has become particularly near and dear to our hearts is this idea of the freedom of religious expression. That, that's what the Maccabees were all about. Were fighting for the right to practice their tradition. And that as American Jews, we have a deep sense of gratitude that especially emerges at the time of Hanukkah, focused on the fact that we have more freedom of religion in the United States than at any previous time in Jewish history, that's for sure. And in contemporary Israel, the military aspect has re-emerged as a theme. So Hanukkah becomes the time for the military parades. So, I just love how the symbols are so universal that they can always adapt to whatever the environment is. Well, whatever the environment throws at us, somewhere in our Jewish arsenal, not to have a military aspect of it, but somewhere in our kit bag, we've got something that is going to respond to whatever the culture throws at us. So it does, Hanukkah does raise a lot of questions, and it's very particularly meaningful to me as a retired soldier. It's the only Jewish holiday that celebrates a military victory. So it does invite reflection on how do we as Jews view war and peace. And a lot of the material in your packet does refer to that particular theme. So clearly nobody wants war. We pray for peace, we work for peace. The rabbis say better a bad peace than a good war. And yet our tradition is clearly not a pacifist tradition. We clearly have the right and maybe obligation of self-defense when we are attacked. And I'm just going to walk you through some of those texts, and you don't necessarily have to turn all the pages and keep up. I'll read the important points, what I think are important. But it's interesting to notice on the bottom of page 5, this is a Talmudic discussion about whether or not you're allowed to fight on Shabbat. Shabbat is such a priority value for us that the idea of fighting on Shabbat is anathema. And when the book of Maccabees does describe how initially the Jewish forces were being slaughtered because of their reluctance to fight on Shabbat. And that's when the rabbi said, look, our right, we're going to desecrate this Shabbat so that we can live to observe many more Shabbatot. So sometimes we have to fight on Shabbat. And a distinction is made between, how close you are to the front lines. Is it a mandatory or a discretionary war? And I don't think we'll go into that too in depth, but you do have some material there if that's of interest to you to look at that distinction. So ultimately, yes, the Maccabees decided that they would fight on Shabbat. But if you notice the text right above that, this is from the Bible, from First Chronicles, that King David, as we know, was a warrior. Remember, he first came to fame in his battle with Goliath and fought many, many wars to consolidate the land, establish Jerusalem as the capital. But he was not permitted to build the temple in Jerusalem, even
Because
though
of war,
but
because of so much bloodshed.
exactly, because his son Shlomo, whose name Solomon has the word shalom in it, didn't have blood on his hands in that way. He was not a warrior. And we needed a person who represented peace, who was going to ultimately build the temple. But I did want to read on the bottom of page 10. This is from Professor Michael Weschograd. So he's talking about, okay, so how do we know when? When is the time to go to war? You know, we want to seek peace and pursue it. We know that text from the Bible. You know, not only to seek peace, but pursue it. We should chase after it. We should run after it. So, you know, we want to compromise a lot for the sake of peace. So where is that proverbial red line that says, okay, this, you know, we now have to go to war? And I like the way Weschograd puts this. He said, from time to time, evils appear on the world scene, which are in a class unto themselves. These are instances of large-scale, premeditated murder of large numbers of human beings in systematic ways. Among cases of this abnormal evil in our century, I was writing in the 20th century, would be the extermination of the Armenians by the Turks in World War I, the Soviet Gulag system, the Holocaust of World War II, and the recent regimes in Uganda and Cambodia. You may have noticed that I have not provided you with a very clear definition of this class of what he calls abnormal evil. I have not done so because I am not able to do so. Certainly, numbers of victims have something to do with it. So does the degree of cruelty involved. And there are other factors. But basically, it comes down to recognizing one when you see one. When dealing with normal evil, non-interference, at least in the military sense, ought to be the rule. But when the situation reaches the level of abnormal evil, this principle of non-interference cannot remain absolute. We are commanded, do not stand by idly at the blood of your brother. There comes a point when military intervention is justified, and the religious community has a duty to speak clearly when that point is reached. So I like the way he puts that, because he does preserve a sense of ambiguity. There's not a specific definition, a specific number of victims. You know, it's kind of like the Supreme Court definition of pornography. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. Same thing with what he says, normal evil, abnormal evil. But it's important to know that turn the other cheek is not the Jewish value. And so much so, in fact, that the Talmud very specifically and clearly says that if someone is pursuing you with the intent to kill, rise up earlier and kill them first. So we are, martyrdom is not necessarily a Jewish value. We have the right to defend ourselves. And let's see, what does Elie Wiesel say? Just the opposite at the top of the page. Jewish prophets don't sanctify our wars. The poets declined to romanticize them. Songs were written to celebrate miracles, not wars. So that's the tension of the holiday of Hanukkah is, yes, we recognize that if the Maccabees had not risen up and fought, we would all not be here right now having this conversation. We would have all assimilated into Greek culture. It would have been the end of Jewish life as we have come to know and love it. And yet, not only for the issue of the political cover that I described earlier, do we not focus on the military aspect, but also the rabbis were clearly uncomfortable with this celebration of the military victory. And that was expressed in the choice of the Haftorah for the Shabbos of Hanukkah. So every year on Hanukkah, we read the Parsha of Miketz, and there's a special Haftorah for Shabbat Hanukkah. It comes from the prophet Zechariah. And what are the words of Zechariah? Not by might and not by power, but by my spirit, says God. So they get that, we had to fight, but we don't want to really celebrate the military aspect. We want to celebrate the spiritual aspect. I mentioned about mandatory and discretionary wars. All of that is codified by Maimonides in his Mishnah Torah, in his 14th book, which is Hilchot Melachim u'Milchemotehem, the laws of kings and their wars. And if you want to take some time, pages 7, 8, and 9, that's where you'll see this discussion about the conduct of war. When do you have to go to war? And there's some beautiful teachings in there. So first of all, you don't go to war without offering terms of peace. First thing you try to do is negotiate for peace. The second thing that I find really touching in Rambam is that you are never allowed to lay siege to a city on all four sides. When you lay siege to a city, the siege can be set up on 3 sides, but you want to leave the 4th side open so that if there are people who want to escape, they have an escape route.
Mhm.
And the other thing, we should actually look at this at the bottom of page 8. So the Torah tells us from the Torah that it's in Deuteronomy, I want to say around, well, he quotes it here actually, Deuteronomy 20. I thought it was later, but I'm sure that's right. That when troops are assembling for war, the priest comes and addresses them. And first of all, anybody who has gotten married and hasn't had a year to live with their wife, go home and make your wife happy. If you built a home and you didn't dedicate it, go home. If you planted a vineyard and you didn't get to yet harvest it and have a little of the wine you planted, you are excused. And also anybody who's scared, like if you're scared, don't be in fear or in panic or in dread. If you're, is anyone afraid and disheartened is the question. Then go home. Better to go to war with a small group who are stalwart and ready to fight than, morale is very contagious. If you don't want to go to war with people who are going to undermine the operation. Better a smaller force of people who are dedicated to the mission than to include people who are going to raise questions about the mission. And then one of the interesting things, and this is alluded to, it looks like on page 10, is that we know that the Torah set up the office of the high priest, and that was a hereditary office. So it started with Aaron and then his sons, and whoever was going to be the high priest to officiate over all the temple rites, hereditary, from father to son, from one generation to the next. There also was a priest for wartime, and you got to know how much, as a army chaplain of 38 years, I love that even in the Torah, they got that the troops need a chaplain. They need a religious leader who's going to come with them and be with them in that experience. But the priest, the military priest, the military chaplain, was not an inherited position. That was something that was appointed for each operation, for each battle, as it were, because there was always the hope that we'll never need this person again. So we, we'll appoint, you're going to be the chaplain for World War I, but no, there's never going to be another war after the war to end all wars. So we'll never need another high priest for wartime again. I think that optimism is so beautiful. I wanted to point out to you that when Solomon built that temple, it was supposed to be built of stones that were not cut with a knife. The Midrash commentary has this category of things that were created before the world was created. There were a number of things that were created before the world were created, and it's a fascinating list. So first of all, teshuvah, repentance. Before the world was even created, we knew that we were going to screw up and need a way back. So teshuvah was already created before the world. This is the genius of the Jewish mind. The tongues that were used to create the first tongues were created before the world was created. So the rabbis are trying to figure out, in order to make tongues, you need tongues to hold what you're going to put in the fire to make tongues. So were the first tongues made? Well, before the world was created, the first tongues were made so that we should be able to make tongues from there. And what else was created before the world on the list? The shamir. This was a magical worm that when Solomon came to build the temple would eat away at the stone to form the bricks. So the bricks shouldn't be cut with an instrument of iron, because that's a symbol of war. And we don't want our holy temple, a place of peace, to be built with instruments of war. So God provided for this special shamir to be made. There's a practice, I don't know if any of you are familiar with, when we say Birkat Hamazon, that people have the practice to cover the knives on the table or to remove the knives from the table, because again, just the knives are expressive of violence. And when we're saying the blessing after the meal, we don't want to do that in the presence of these instruments of violence. So I guess the big takeaway I'd like you to take from this conversation is the balance that we have between the necessity of war and the desire for peace, and how we live with that tension and try to find that balance. But I love this quote from Golda Meir on page 11. A leader who doesn't stutter before he sends his nation into battle is not fit to be a leader. This is not something that you undertake lightly, to go to war. And I wanted to also make sure we give a little due attention on page 14 to two of the female heroines of the Hanukkah story. So on page 14, the story of Judith. Anybody know about Judith? Her story is told in the Apocrypha.
I only know it from an art history perspective,
Ah,
which is that it is a very common theme because it's so gory and it enables an artist to really show their chops in terms
that's
of,
interesting, Hillary. What's your background? Is art history an avocation or?
it was my major in college.
Really? How fun.
Yeah,
I don't know
so
if you know, there's a woman named Marcy Lee who lives in Tempe.
mhm.
Man, you would love to connect with her sometime. She has made a life's work out of studying biblical women depicted in art. And she has
Oh, that's amazing.
a whole series of amazing, she's self-taught, of amazing presentations that she has of different depictions of biblical women in artworks and what we can learn about how they were viewed through those depictions.
Yeah, like cutting people's heads off and
Yeah,
making,
so Judith, yeah,
they're
so
put on pikes and,
yeah,
yeah,
right. We don't have
exactly.
a lot of time, but yeah, Hillary cut to the essence of that, no pun intended. So, Judith, you know, women have not had a lot of routes to power necessarily historically, but Judith used her beauty and her powers of seduction. She snuck into the enemy camp with a basket of wine and very salty cheese. And she fed it to Holofernes, the enemy general, all this salty cheese, and then plied him with wine. And then when he fell asleep from all of the wine, she cut his head off. And that was apparently what led to the win in the battle. The troops were so demoralized when they saw the head of their leader that they fled, and that was the end of the war. And then also continuing there on page 15 is the horribly gruesome story of Hannah and her 7 sons. And I can't even recommend that you read it in Maccabees because it's just so horrible how one child after another is tortured and killed in front of their mother. Basically, there's an idolatrous altar set up, and one kid after the other is told, you know, bow down to this idol or we'll kill you. And they work from eldest to youngest, and then they get to the youngest, and you know, there's some sense of compassion, and they throw down like a little shiny object and tell the kid to pick it up so it'll look like he's bowing down to the idol. And the kid refuses to do it, and the last child dies there as well. On page 17, I discovered this in my files. This was a sermon that I gave about the holiday of Hanukkah while I was a student in the Army War College. So I think I found it really funny going back now to read it. You could see how I was looking at it from the perspective of you know, military leadership, but looking at it as I quoted Colin Gray, belligerents who find themselves materially challenged will seek strategic compensation primarily by means of adopting asymmetric strategies that might offset their disadvantages. So basically, what Colin Gray is saying that I then applied to the story of Hanukkah is we were outnumbered, we were out-resourced. There was, so we had to resort to what we would now call basically a terrorist campaign of insurrection, asymmetric of fighting. And then finally, I just want to call your attention to pages 24 to 26, which is written by Alan Moranis, the founder of the Musar Institute, looking at the holiday of Hanukkah from the perspective of Musar. And he looks at, well, what are the character traits, the midot that emerge in this holiday? And he talks about the holiday being a celebration of bitachon, of trust, of faith, of belief. You know, where did, I've heard Hanukkah described also as the holiday of holy chutzpah. So where did the Jewish people have the faith? You know, we have only enough oil to last for one day, and we lit that, and miraculously it worked for it stayed lit for 8 days. So the holiday being expressive of the midah of faith, that a lot of times we all find ourselves in our lives in a place where we don't know where the strength and the resources to move forward are going to come from, but guess what? We need to move forward anyway, and how inspiring Hanukkah is in that regard. But it does raise actually the question of one of my favorite Hanukkah conundrums is, okay, so they had enough oil for one day, and they lit the menorah, and that oil burned for one day, and then miraculously it burned for 7 more days. So really we should observe 7 days of Hanukkah, because there was no miracle on the first day. The first day there was enough oil, they lit it, it burned. The miracle was really the 7 days. So why do we have 8 days of Hanukkah? To celebrate that miracle of faith, the miracle of the fact that we don't know how we're gonna get through this, but we're gonna do it anyway, and that in itself is miraculous. So we have just a moment if there are any questions or comments, and before just one final thought. Okay, I think you're off next week, and then the following week, you're going to start to delve a little deeper into the preparation for the service with the cantor. So I think that's the preview of coming attractions. But I wish everyone, of course, a beautiful Hanukkah. The greeting we say is Chag Orim Sameach, a happy holiday of lights. And I'm just going to conclude by reading, this is on page 11 if you want to locate it, a poem that I love by the Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai, and he's playing with this idea of they should beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, that beautiful line from the prophet Isaiah in his vision of peace. And he calls this poem an appendix to the vision of peace. He says, don't stop after beating the swords into plowshares. Don't stop. Go on beating and making musical instruments out of them. Whoever wants to make war again will have to turn them into plowshares first. So I will leave you with that. It's lovely to see everyone. Have a great rest of your evening. And
You too. Thank you so much. Happy
Thank you,
Hanukkah to
Rabbi.
everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Happy Hanukkah.
thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Great to see everyone.